So Justin, thank you. Thank you for being on the Provoke and Inspire podcast once more. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me back. It's been a little while, but it's great to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to be here, and I think you're probably aware we have a few other guys that are regulars here, but we are, as we are wont to do, given our context, we are dispersed worldwide. My dad, David Pierce, is actually in Russia right now, believe it or not, doing a training for the work that we have there. Needless to say, he needs prayers for safety and for wisdom, and this will come out once he's back. So
Great.
assumably everything will have gone well there. And Luke, your fellow Brit, he's in France actually doing a training there. And Chad, he's probably sleeping because it's 6 a.m. from here in the U.S. So here we are. You just got me, so hopefully that's all right.
No, I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I always am amazed at just the breadth of what you guys do, and truly international ministry. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and it's cool. It's a challenge, right? But the international component makes a podcast like this, given that you know a thing or two about sticking it out and longevity. We hit our 500th episode not too long ago, and we've done them in vans and in airports, and we've been dispersed all over the planet, and somehow, some way, through technology and perseverance, here we still are. So,
wow.
Hey,
Great
so
stuff.
you have a lot of new things going on, and those probably most familiar with you would be familiar with the thing you did forever, the Unbelievable show, the podcast, the radio show. But things have changed. Tell us what's going on now. What are you doing?
Yeah, well, at the time of recording, it's been just over a year since I moved on from hosting the Unbelievable show, which was a very bittersweet goodbye to a show I hosted for 17 and a half years. And for those who don't know, it was a kind of Christian, non-Christian discussion and debate show. Began really just as a radio show in the UK, but then we were kind of very early adopters of podcasting. Eventually moved into the YouTube space as well. And Unbelievable grew to encompass books and a conference and websites, and we kind of grew the brand out to other podcasts and resources and things. So it was a wonderful journey over those 17 and a half years. I learned an awful lot along the way, wrote my own book about that and my case for faith, really. And it opened up all kinds of opportunities. Coming to sort of, there were lots of things that came together that for me were just signs, I guess, from God that it was time for me to do something new, to spread my wings a bit, and start to work on some new projects. I was already working and had been writing this book that came out last year, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and that's very much taken a lot of the conversations from Unbelievable. And sort of looked at the way in which I think the conversations have changed significantly in the last several years. Yeah. And so it was, as I say, I've got so much gratitude for everything that was accomplished through that show, which continues, under new management and with guest presenters and things. But I'm really also enjoying this opportunity to sort of just, spread my wings, do some new things, collaborate with some people. And so there's lots of, interesting and exciting projects currently underway in my sort of new season of life and work.
Yeah, I really, if I'm honest, I can't really imagine Unbelievable without your voice. It's, like when The Price is Right moved to a different host, thankfully you're still alive.
Oh yes, that's true. Yes, I haven't actually shuffled off this mortal coil just yet,
but not just yet.
That's very kind of you to say. I mean, obviously I loved the show and hosting it, and God willing, I will, in due course probably move back towards doing something in the same area of that kind of dialogue and hosting, moderating, those kinds of conversations. But it's been fun to kind of be able to stretch my muscles a bit to kind of just do something a bit different. And that's definitely with the most recent project I've been working on, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It's been fun to kind of return actually to what I did even before Unbelievable began. So because my career in radio spans, over 20 years. And that was actually producing documentary feature style radio features, and that's essentially what this new podcast documentary series is, the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. So it's been fun to kind of be able to do a bit more storytelling. And that's been one of the great benefits of having that space to do that.
Yeah. Well, that takes courage. I mean, anything you do for 17 years, it can become so part of your identity. I'm sure that that must have been a difficult decision, but it's exciting to see what God's doing. And maybe just starting with this question for those listening, why does it matter for us to understand the sort of the meta conversation about religion or public perception about the conversation on faith? Why, for someone listening who loves all this, but maybe isn't, I find myself very inclined to these kinds of conversations and the academics and the apologetics. Why is it important for Christians to be aware of the changing in perception, the shifts, the trends? Why does that really help our faith in general?
Well, I think that understanding the culture we're in is something we are called to do as Christians in order to be effective witnesses for Christ. It's what Paul was doing famously, on the Areopagus in Mars Hill in Greece, when he addressed the Athenian philosophers and Stoics of his day. He didn't just go in and speak to them the way he spoke to his Jewish, fellows. He understood their culture. Yeah. He put his message across to them about this person, Jesus Christ, in a way that was relevant to them. And that's, in a sense, what I've always sought to do with my apologetics, which simply means, intellectual defense of the Christian faith. I want to make it culturally relevant to people so that the message, which is eternal and doesn't change, nevertheless lands within a new context. So that's why I would say it's important to kind of be aware of what's changing. Sometimes I think the church can end up answering the questions of 10 or 15 years ago when maybe those questions have changed and maybe the context within which those questions are being asked has changed. So that's kind of what I'm trying to map out with this book. Is a lot has changed actually since I started hosting conversations between Christians and atheists, because when I kicked off that show in 2005, it was kind of just when the new atheism as a movement was really rolling into town. There were best-selling atheist books. There were the rise of essentially the internet was creating these communities of skeptics who could get together both online and in person. And there was just a lot of kind of a lot of noise and fanfare media around this new so-called new atheist phenomenon. And that was kind of where the conversation was in the culture. So that's naturally where I tended to take the conversations. I hosted a lot of those more dogmatic, pugnacious atheists on the show, opposite Christian thinkers. And it was good. It was needed. It was a necessary response to those big questions that were being leveled at Christianity during that time. But as I say, kind of, I tell the story in this new book about the way that I did see, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, the conversation changed quite dramatically. Partly because I think the new atheism itself sort of had this internal collapse where it really, once it had agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, it really couldn't agree on much else. And the architects of the movement all fell out with each other quite dramatically. And that was interesting to watch from the sidelines. But more than that, I think it ultimately didn't answer people's existential questions about meaning and purpose and identity. And I saw the rise of not necessarily Christians asking or answering those questions, but actually other secular intellectuals who were kind of commanding just as large stages and platforms as the new atheists had, but who were far more sympathetic to Christian faith, who were not dismissing it out of hand, who weren't ridiculing it as the new atheist did. And so I started to just notice that the tone of the conversations I was hosting was changing quite radically. And that was, I think, because the culture was changing, because the questions people were asking were changing. So the book was in response to that, the fact that actually we need to be ready for a very different vibe that's going on at the moment in our culture when it comes to the way they think about God and religion. Yeah.
We often say in our mission that we can be guilty of answering questions people aren't asking. And I think that's what you were alluding to with being 10 to 15 years behind. So it's really more just the macro version of caring about people individually. Like, what are they actually thinking? What are they actually wrestling with? And how are we meeting them there with the eternal truth of the gospel and Jesus, obviously. So I heard you describe new atheism as kind of a gift for Christianity in some ways, which of course seems confusing on the surface. So what do you mean by that? Or what did you mean by that?
I think it was in a funny way. Yeah, the new atheism at one level was a tremendous challenge to Christianity. And obviously it did create a number of deconverts who sort of were persuaded by the books and the conferences and the videos and so on. I would say to some extent that the people who kind of got turned into atheists by new atheism were probably ripe to be harvested, if you like, by it, because it kind of obviously kind of drove a train through a kind of nominal Christianity, people who hadn't really thought about it or weren't, particularly committed in that sense. It gave a kind of some answers, if you like, reasons why you could, stay in bed on a Sunday morning rather than go to church or whatever. But the interesting thing about the movement itself, though, is that it didn't, as much as I think it was just more a reflection of the continuing secularization of the culture rather than necessarily a sort of brand new movement.
Right.
And when you actually look at the statistics, obviously we've had a continued decline in religiosity, decline in church going in the West for a few decades now. But the actual number of people describing themselves as atheists hasn't actually changed that much. It's maybe gone up 1 percentage point or something in the last 15 or 20 years. So it's not that they were, I think, actually converting that many people to a kind of scientist, materialist, atheist kind of perspective. It was just that it was what it was in that moment, a kind of convenient way for people to kind of say, well, actually, I think religion's had its day and we're, I'm an agnostic, or I'm just not that interested, in it anymore.
Yeah.
So that was, but in terms of the kind of headlines it generated, it did look very bombastic and very sort of, important in that way. I apologize.
Yeah.
My doorbell's just gone. Can I just quickly?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah,
you're good. And
Yep. No worries.
Sorry. Do you want to go ahead and?
We're good. We're good. I can jump in here and we can go from there. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it didn't necessarily produce a whole army of atheists that didn't exist before. I think it probably just gave them a voice in a weird sort of way. It kind of gave them a language too, right? That kind of helped structure their unbelief, if you will, or a way to articulate what they didn't like about religion. And now we had these popular figures that kind of gave empowered in a way for it to be okay, even vocally anti-theistic. And so you saw that. And as you said, I think it produced maybe the responses had always been there, just like new atheism wasn't very new. Great arguments against atheism weren't necessarily new either. It's sort of, we got the popularized response to it. And so now the whole conversation became popular.
And coming back to your original question, which slightly went out of my mind there, but why did I welcome it? I think I welcomed it because actually it did force the church to actually wake up intellectually.
Right.
I think for quite a while, the church had kind of gone into a sort of a sense of a more kind of emotional way of engaging the gospel and spirituality. And there's nothing wrong with emotions. I'm not against, the emotions. That's an important part of it. But I think it had sometimes been at the expense of its intellectual tradition. And so I think the new atheists coming along and asking some hard questions in their books and things did force the church to get out its apologetics and theology books again.
Yeah.
And you saw the rise of a number of, quite significant now ministries, people like William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith, ministry, I'd say, really flourished because it had the new atheism to answer and to deal with. Likewise, Robert Barron's, Word on Fire ministry from a Catholic perspective, hugely influential now. And I think because the internet allowed these kinds of itinerant ministries to flourish, and I would say the same of my Unbelievable show, it it only became as popular as it did because the new atheism kind of was a really strong sort of force to kind of engage with it. They really had something to say, and it created an interesting tension and, good media and everything else. So to that extent, I think we can thank Richard Dawkins for forcing the church in that way to up its game.
Yeah.
And the irony is, even I know plenty of people who have actually become Christians because of the new atheism, ironically. So it's not that it only created deconverts, it actually converted some people to Christianity because, it's funny when I think back to the atheist bus campaign, which was these red London buses circulating the capital saying there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Well, in the UK, it was almost like the most unnecessary campaign you could think of because no one was really bothered. Like there's been agnosticism, non-belief, was just the de facto norm. So ironically, putting that statement on a bus was more likely to make someone think about God for the first time in a long time. And that was so interesting because actually I think it injected interest into the God question rather than making people, not worry about whether there's a God. They started thinking, oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Maybe there is a God. And I know a number of people for whom starting to watch the work of Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, the four horsemen of new atheism was actually the kind of catalyst for them actually bumping into good quality Christian apologetics as well. And they became Christians. So one of my good friends and now colleague, a guy called Peter Byram, is a classic example of this. He went to university. Any sort of faith he'd had in his childhood kind of fizzled out. He became a very happy skeptic, kind of got to do what he wanted at university. And when he sort of bumped into the work of Richard Dawkins and others, it kind of just confirmed his skepticism. And it's like, oh, this is good. I've got reasons to kind of reject all that stuff now. But as he continued to read and engage with their stuff on YouTube, he suddenly started to find responses like William Lane Craig, and he suddenly started to realize, it turns out there are some not too bad responses to these atheist arguments. I mean, that led him down a rabbit hole where I ended up working alongside him, even while he was still not a Christian, on a tour where we brought William Lane Craig over to the UK. And it was during that tour in 2011 that Peter finally gave his life to Christ. And it was just so interesting to see the journey that took him to that place, because it started with actually being, convinced by Dawkins that God didn't exist initially. So it's amazing the things God can still use, for his purposes.
Yeah. It seems that just maybe leaving it alone might have been the best approach by the four horsemen. Interesting. And from where have we then shifted, right? So we have the rise of new atheism, which again is just sort of the amplification of something that maybe already existed, but just in more bombastic terminology. Then you have the counterpunch that kind of goes on and on for a little while. People start to sort of recognize, they either get tired of the conversation or they kind of recognize a lot of it's like, okay, you're against this thing, but what are you for? Like, can you tell me why I'm here, or what the point of all this, or how I decide what's true? Where have things shifted from there? Where are we? What climate do we find ourselves in now, and how do we respond?
Well, as I say, I started to notice the conversations change, and I think by and large, the questions people had didn't go away, because science and reason are good for some things, but they're not going to give you a sense of your personal value or what life is for, why you're here. And increasingly, what I think even the new atheists are recognizing is that people are kind of inherently religious. You can't really stamp the religiosity out of people. It'll just morph into something else. If you take away the Christian story, they're still going to need something bigger than themselves to make sense of themselves and life. And what people tend to do, they don't tend to replace belief in God with a sort of scientific rationalism, which I think is what naively Dawkins and co hoped would happen.
Right.
What happens is other ideologies, other kind of quasi-religious forms of thinking take their place. And so I think we've seen a lot of this in our culture in various ways. The rise of, for instance, sexual and gender identities.
Sure.
They kind of do for a lot of people, have a quasi-religious aspect to them. They are sacred, unquestionable. You have almost, religious symbolism around them in terms of the garments or the flags or the rituals.
There's a community,
and a kind of
like a church.
And a kind of a growing kind of orthodoxy about what is and isn't allowed, and heretics, if people question it. So
interesting.
J.K. Rowling arguably is one of those, who was once considered an insider and then has, from what she's, because of her stance against transgender, is now seen as a heretic of the movement. So it's a kind of, I think just that kind of thing can easily become kind of quasi-religious, and people will put something in the place of God. But it's not just on the sort of progressive left. It can be a political mythology on the right, a kind of make America great again, sort of Donald Trump cult or whatever. People will put a story to make sense of life, basically. But the problem is all these stories are bumping up against each other, and we've got the culture wars because of it. Because none of these stories are the story we're meant to put at the center of our life. That only God, made known in Jesus Christ, is the story that will actually satisfy and make sense of people's lives. So what I've noticed is that as kind of there's been this growing confusion and tribalism and polarization in our culture, I think it's because we've lost the Christian story. People are trying to replace it with other stories that don't work in place of that. And I think it's got to a tipping point now where we're now seeing people recognize, especially some of these secular intellectuals I interview for the book, that actually by losing Christianity, we've lost something really significant in our culture. We've lost a kind of a foundational thing that kind of helped our culture to flourish and helped to bind people together and give them a sense of meaning and purpose and identity. And that's why I think you're now finding people like, say, Jordan Peterson, saying, hey, attracting thousands of, especially young men, to his lectures on the Bible and pointing them back towards the Christian story as potentially a source of meaning and wisdom and purpose. Likewise, lots of other secular psychologists like John Vervaeke and Jonathan Haidt and others, in no way dismissing Christianity, but saying, actually, maybe we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Now, these aren't necessarily believers, but they're people who recognize the value, at least, of the Christian story, and the way in which it has shaped our lives and the West. And I would add to that a whole host of other people who have increasingly been kind of quite public, even as secular intellectuals, about what we might be losing if we lose the Christian story in our culture. So that would be people like the historian Tom Holland, the sort of cultural critic Douglas Murray, Louise Perry, who's quite an interesting writer on sex and relationships now, who's kind of come to a very kind of pro-Christian view, even as a secular sort of liberal feminist up to a point. She kind of realized actually that the only way you can really guard healthy, flourishing relationships is essentially something like a Christian morality around it. So there's all kinds of interesting thinkers who are suddenly kind of coming back to a sort of a Christian understanding, even if they haven't quite kind of leaped in themselves to the Christian story. I'm just seeing them influence an awful lot of people and making it intellectually possible for people to take Christianity seriously again, because these are people who essentially are reaching the same audience as the new atheists were, but they've got a very, very different sort of way of talking about religion now. So that is kind of at the center of the book. I think something's changed in the culture, and the church needs to take notice of that.
Yeah. I think it's tempting on the surface to celebrate it, right? To be like, that's awesome. They're on our team. These very prominent voices who are being so well received are essentially at least presenting a positive case for the value or the benefits of Christianity, be it some sort of myth or some sort of way of understanding the world or something we do psychologically, whatever it is. And again, I'm not here to be the one to discern the if their faith is real or if it's just something that they're sort of borrowing for the sake of their intellectual arguments. But what can we celebrate about it, maybe to start? And what should make us cautious in terms of the version of Christianity that they're championing and that's being celebrated, as opposed to maybe the real thing?
So I think, like you said, we can celebrate, take some comfort in the idea that the kind of secular material narrative that has been so dominant in our culture is being challenged, and that in a sense people are waking up to the fact that we can't live on this thin gruel, this story that we're ultimately a kind of the end result of a completely purposeless process. I think that's got a lot to do with actually why we're living in this so-called meaning crisis. The fact that people feel obliged to kind of invent themselves from scratch today. And it's just an intolerable burden, especially upon young people in a technological age. And I think just a lot of these secular thinkers are kind of just pointing that out and saying, this is not good for us. And that's why they're kind of encouraging people to kind of take seriously some of those traditions, especially Christianity, that sort of give you where you inherit your identity from something that's kind of got a long history, and in that way. So I think that's valuable. I think obviously where there's a question mark is, firstly, there's a lot of people who I think want something like cultural Christianity to return. They want the benefits of Christianity,
right?
The sort of the trappings, if you like, in terms of the values and the security and so on, but without necessarily the actual cost of becoming a Christian and the kind of radical call to transformation that potentially means on someone's life. So I see a lot of people talking, certainly in positive terms about Christianity, but it's in a kind of, I'm glad it's there. I'm glad some people are convinced by it, but it's a sort of almost, obviously I can't believe in that myself.
Right.
It's okay for other people to. And I think that's dangerous because a kind of cultural or political Christianity isn't actually going to be good for anyone. It's actually going to be as divisive as any other thing, because it's just another idol in that case. It's just another kind of, because if it doesn't have Jesus actually at the center of it, it loses all its power and becomes actually potentially very divisive. That's always been the case in the church when people have replaced Jesus with politics or power and kind of just baptized in the name of Christianity. It's always a recipe for disaster. We know that. So I've no interest in that. And I think there is a danger of it going in that direction. People who kind of potentially want to use this new interest in religion and faith for essentially political purposes. So I think that is a real danger of it. At the same time, so I think it could go off in different directions. The other point is simply that Christianity isn't even the only game in town when it comes to the options on the table for people. There's a kind of there's a vacuum now in our culture where, and lots of, as I say, stories are trying to fill it. And Islam is another option on the table. I see a lot of young men very attracted to it because it gives them a real sense of meaning and purpose and identity. There's a kind of group dynamic to it. Don't underestimate how attractive that is going to become to a lot of people looking for meaning and purpose and identity. Likewise, it's just what G.K. Chesterton said, I think, is just coming true, which is once people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. So it's about what is trying to fill this gap at the moment, and how can we show people that Christianity is the good, true, and beautiful story that they're actually looking for, and not just a kind of, not just using it as a sort of another political tool, basically. As some people I think are maybe tempted to use it.
Yeah, it's a weird, paradox in a sense where we can almost be lulled into an apathy if the culture around us becomes more open rather than more hostile to the gospel, in the sense that we think that, okay, if it's generally positively perceived and we have these online or just these intellectuals making a positive case and sort of the temperature goes down on the hostility towards Christianity, we can maybe think, all right, our work is done here in a sense, right? But as you say, you hear that the sort of the positive view of it collectively or as some sort of story for us to understand the world we live in. But then there's always that personal arm's length of, well, but I'm not going to personally surrender to this thing for myself. And so, I mean, do you agree that this could actually we need to be cautious in seeing this as sort of the job done, when really maybe all it's done is created a positive climate for the work to start.
I think it's potentially changed. Yeah, I think it's potentially created a more positive climate for people to just consider Christianity. But a lot of what they're hearing from these folks is not Christianity.
No,
it's like in Jordan Peterson's case, it's a kind of Jungian spin on the Bible, basically. And now I think God in his grace is using Jordan Peterson to draw people to genuine Christianity. So I think he's opening the door actually for a lot of people to walk through and discover actually, oh, it turns out, to find the real thing in that way. I mean, even his wife has become a very committed Catholic. His daughter Michaela has become a Christian. So I feel like the net is almost closing in on Peterson himself in that way. But I just think, it's just that, like anything, these are a whole variety of different personalities with different motivations. Some people, I think, are somewhere over here on the spectrum who are saying, I'm basically an atheist. But I can see the value of Christianity. So even Richard Dawkins, of all people, has come out and basically said that recently, saying, actually, I quite like having cultural Christianity because it's better than some of the alternatives, speaking in that case of Islam. And that's very interesting, isn't it? When even Richard Dawkins will basically say nice things about some of the benefits of Christianity. I like the hymns. I like the churches and cathedrals. I like the kind of the general atmosphere it's created in the country I live in. But at the same time, he's still trying to persuade people that it's not true. And you obviously, the thing is, you're not going to have all of those nice things if people no longer believe it. So you've got interesting people like that on one level saying nice things, but basically saying it's still just false. You've got people a bit further over who are kind of like to label it a sort of useful fiction, who say it's, I want to encourage it. I've no problem with people believing it because it's good for us, basically. But I still don't believe it myself. And again, that's that kind of where people maybe start to use it for political purposes and that kind of thing. Then you've got, I think, people who are actually see the value of Christianity, but they're also attracted to it themselves, and they kind of would like to believe. And I meet quite a few of these who are have recognized how much Christianity has shaped our world. And that would be people like Tom Holland, the historian here in the UK, who has very much gone on an intellectual journey as a historian, looking at the world of the ancient Greeks and Romans, becoming a best-selling popular historian of that era, but recognizing in the process just how alien their values are to his own. So that this was a world where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, where the lives of women and children were cheap. Some people could be the sexual property of other people. And all these different ways in which he recognized that his values of equality and dignity and freedom and compassion and progress were like 100 miles apart from these people. And so where did he get those values from? He realized he got them specifically from Jesus Christ, that it was the Christian revolution that completely changed the way people think about all of those things. And we now, as he puts it, whether we call ourselves Christian or not, we're all swimming in the West in the cultural assumptions of Christianity. So he says, I'm, in almost every respect, he tells me I am a Christian, even as I struggle to believe in the actual supernatural claims of Christianity. But again, he's someone who's very much gone on a journey where he's more or less, accepted Christianity himself because he sees how beautiful it is and he wants it to be true. So you've got people who are kind of, teetering on the edge almost of actually saying, no, actually, if the reason this is so beautiful is because it's actually true. And then right on the other, on the far end of that spectrum, you've got people who have jumped fully in. And I tell the story of a number of those who have kind of taken the challenge and said, actually, the reason that this story attracts me so much is because it's true, and I'm jumping in, and it's transformed their life. And one example of that would be a celebrated poet and author here in the UK called Paul Kingsnorth, who went through this really interesting journey of sort of teenage atheism through a sort of career in sort of environmental activism, writing, speaking. But he always wanted to he always had this kind of awe and wonder in the presence of nature. And he kind of wanted to express that in some way. He tried it for many years in Buddhism, sort of looking inside, but it didn't satisfy in the end. He ended up becoming a Wiccan, so out in the woods, chanting, doing kind of things, kind of effectively trying to worship nature itself. But he kind of soon realized it wasn't the thing. And to his own great surprise, he ended up becoming a Christian. And he said that was the last thing he was expecting. He'd kind of consigned that to childish, things that he'd put away a long time ago. And all kinds of interesting things happened to him to bring him to the point where he says he kind of got dragged kicking and screaming out of Wicca into Christian faith. But again, it's so interesting seeing I'm bumping into more and more of those stories of adult converts to Christianity. And they're not all simple and kind of tied up in a bow type stories. Yeah. They're often complicated stories and histories, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that such and such person says, but nonetheless, something's happened where they've said, actually, I've lost faith in secular materialism, and I've decided, actually, I'm going to give this Christian story a go. And I find that really interesting because as I say, I'm bumping into more and more of those stories all the time. It's for me, it's kind of confirming this thesis that I've had in the back of my mind for a few years now, that the temperature has changed, the atmosphere has changed, the tide is kind of turning in a way.
Yeah. And you definitely feel that, this is very obviously anecdotal, but just even from an online perspective, from a influencer celebrities perspective, it does seem to be more and more common now for these professions of faith, or at least, like you said, for people to be inching along that spectrum. Joe Rogan seems to be another one in my mind that kind of seems to be inching along that spectrum. Why do you think it is that in a world that, in my mind, especially in light of the new temperature, seems to be very open to someone being a Buddhist or becoming a Wiccan? That one they might find a little more odd, but in general, it's like, do you, whatever is fine. Why, even as you described by this poet, how he said, well, everything but Christianity until I got there, and whoa, lo and behold, now I'm a Christian. Why is there this? I mean, I think I have some thoughts, but I want yours on that being like the last resort that people seem to be kicking and screaming towards, but that seems to be inevitably where they're being dragged, and then Jordan Peterson and others. Yeah. What is it? What is it that makes that so difficult to make that leap?
Yeah, I think it's a lot to do with the problem, as Tom Holland has often put it, is that Christianity has been too successful, and because it's embedded itself and its cultural assumptions so much in the West, it's become almost invisible in that way. And to that extent, I think a lot of people, if they've kind of had some kind of cultural awareness of Christianity, they think they know what Christianity is, but they may never have actually bumped into the real thing is a problem. And so I think a lot of people dismiss it because they think they basically know what it is. And I think that's probably true in Paul Kingsnorth's case. And so that's the great danger, is you can kind of, it's a bit like being inoculated against a disease. You have just a small amount of it, and it kind of builds up a barrier against that, so that when the real thing comes along, you can fend it off easily. And I think people kind of, sadly, in a kind of cultural Christian background, kind of become inoculated against Christianity in that kind of way. So, which is interesting, why I think actually there's almost a sense in which you do have to have that kind of nominal cultural Christianity almost has to die sometimes before the real thing can reassert itself. And I think that's kind of what's been happening in our culture. As much as we fret about decline in church going and everything else, there's actually something sometimes positive about the fact that people don't have lots of baggage and associations with Christianity. And one of the interesting things about the most recent statistics coming out, especially about young people in Gen Z, who have kind of missed, who are now not just, unchurched, but de-churched. They're kind of like, they don't have any sort of real,
almost post-Christian.
It's that they don't. What the statistics seem to be telling us is that they are the most open to questions of spirituality and God, far more open than, the millennials and the Gen X and the boomers. The boomers are very open because they kind of came in on the wave, but it's almost like the Gen Z have missed the new atheism. That is actually, they never saw, they were still in nappies when Richard Dawkins was doing his thing.
Diapers for the American audience.
Yeah, that's right. And it's so interesting when I meet folk and interact with them, because they see this thing that I think of still as quite a recent current phenomenon, as like history, that happened
an
in
era,
the mid
a Wikipedia entry. Yeah,
exactly. And it awakens me to the fact that we are, with every kind of new generation in that sense, they're going to have a very different sort of experience. And of course, this is the generation that are digital natives, that are completely, influenced in every way by the nature of technology today. And so that's the other big difference, is that that, as we know from all the books that are being written and articles and surveys, is having a huge impact on mental health. And so all of these things, I think, are coming together in a way to kind of create a bit of a perfect storm, where actually there's a sort of, there's a kind of hunger almost. There's a kind of desperation for something to make sense, because life is so painful for so many people. And they're not discounting Christianity. It's no longer, as it is for some of those older folks, as I say, oh, well, I know that wouldn't work. I mean, why aren't other religions or worldviews, why isn't Wicca? I mean, well, actually, as I said earlier, there are other things on the table.
Right, sure.
Witch talk is a phenomenon on TikTok.
Crazy.
People try. So all of that's there. It's all, there's a lot of options on the table. And I'm not saying Christianity is the only game in town, but I guess I'm even at one level, while I don't want anyone to engage in paganism, what I do see is it's still a sign that people are looking for it.
Yeah.
There's a kind of hunger there, and they're kind of reaching out for these false idols. And if this is a great opportunity for the church to show them that there is a story that's going to satisfy that longing, that deep desire. So I guess it's my optimistic evangelist hat on. I just think the conditions are ripe at the moment for the Christian story to suddenly become meaningful again for a lot of people.
Yeah. And trying to tie some of this together, I think the rise of the new atheism was in many ways almost the tipping point of the straw man of Christianity that they felt they had to respond to, right? So you say that the cultural baggage that so many people in the West grew up in, they think they knew what Christianity was, and it was typified by the sort of accusations levied against it by the new atheists. It's all these things. So it's almost like it boils to the surface, and they feel the need to respond to this version of Christianity that, of course, you and I don't even recognize hardly, right? So then you have the response, and that was necessary for that time. And it was certainly a barrier that millennials and Gen X dealt with. They had to rid themselves of this false view of Jesus before they could consider the real one. And that was a real barrier. But part of my, the very first question I asked, why is this important? Well, I think, as you say, it's important because Gen Z, they're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? They don't have a lot of the same baggage, which makes them spiritually open. And of course, there's other things we have to contend with, sexuality being a major, of course, barrier for Gen Z to be willing to accept a Christian faith that has pretty clear injunctions on that. But would you say that this in some ways allows us to just be a little bit more simple with the whole thing? I feel like we've seen in our mission a hunger for just tell me what's true. Like you don't need to go through all of these hurdles or deal with all of these objections. We're finding that there is an openness to just a very clear, plain presentation of the gospel. Are you finding that? Does that make sense?
I absolutely am. Yeah. And sometimes I think we sometimes imagine barriers that aren't necessarily there, especially among younger people. So I think that's true. And it's extraordinary nowadays, I think, what you can see happen with just a conversation, just a sort of light bulb moment, and so I'm encouraged in that sense. Now, that's not to say that, as you just hinted at, there's a lot of kind of cultural stuff going on in the mix that is going to be a challenge for when it comes to the challenge of the gospel and what it means for people's lives, particularly around sexuality and so on. Though even there, I'm seeing some interesting movements, and this might just be me being over optimistic. But again, I mentioned earlier this Louise Perry, and it may not be a name that's familiar to you, Ben, but
I've read her book.
Yeah, so she published this book a couple of years ago called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution.
Yeah, that's the one I read.
Yeah. And I just think her experience and story is one that I'm seeing mirrored elsewhere, which is she grew up with absolutely all the, de facto assumptions that are baked in now to a kind of post-Christian sexual revolution society that basically is you can do whatever you like as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. It's just, sexuality is just what you make it, basically. And then she grew up with that sort of, but then after university, she started working in a rape crisis center, and it completely changed her view on this because she saw what that view of sex was doing to so many women and children. And she wrote this book almost purely, not with any kind of faith kind of perspective at all,
right?
But just from a purely kind of socio-evolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
And she wrote a very convincing case that sexual revolution has been good for a certain number of men, but very bad for women and for children. And she kind of went through all of the arguments for this and came in the end, to her own surprise, I think, to surprisingly Christian conclusions that there was, in fact, this funny old institution that we'd sort of assumed was just, behind us, called monogamous marriage, which, as it happens, has been the best thing for putting guardrails on sex and relationships in a way that allows individuals, families, and cultures to flourish.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting to read that book, and then I've had a few conversations with Louise about it, because she is bumping into more and more people, young people, who just are kind of exhausted by what sex and relationships has become today.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't specifically speaking to issues around same-sex relationships and so on, but just generally, I think there's a sense in which there's burnout now about the way we treat sex and relationships. And there's almost a willingness, once someone kind of lifts the lid on that, to say, maybe I've been getting this whole thing wrong. Maybe the story I was told by the culture is actually not the real story about how we do this. So even there, which feels like the hardest kind of barrier, I absolutely admit, that kind of the baked in assumptions about sex and morality in our culture, even there, I think there's a kind of dawning awareness that the story that's become so popular is actually the story that's hurting us. So who knows where that'll lead? I'm not saying it's easy, but even there, I think there's a kind of the beginnings of even young people starting to realize this isn't good for me.
Right. Yeah. And you're seeing, she's obviously a prominent voice in that. You think of Abigail Schreier and the work that she's doing. And I feel like you're going to start seeing the consequences of some of these movements, I would say, especially in transgender movement, that I think are going to start asking some serious questions about the ideologies that were fueling them and the consequences they're having on people that fell prey to those ideologies. So yeah, wow, it's intense. Well, look, I feel like we could go on and on. I greatly appreciate you, and I'm very excited about this journey that you're on. You're justinbrierley.com, correct? That's the website.
Right. Yeah. That's right. That's the book.
You got right. Someone didn't steal your name. You didn't have to go like .edu or .tv or something. You got it. No, well done.
That's all good. Yeah. So
this
the book is available now.
Yep. Sorry. Go ahead.
justinbrierley.com, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. You can even get signed copies actually on the website if you're interested in that.
Awesome.
The other place to actually check out is the podcast, the Surprising Rebirth podcast. I think if you move along to that menu item, you'll bring it up actually, Ben.
Yep, we're right there.
That's a very deep dive into the whole subject of the book, really.
Great.
And I'm really enjoying this because it just allows me to talk to all kinds of people, tell all kinds of news stories. So whenever you publish a book, it's kind of, that's the story up to that point, and it's good. But but this is allowing me to kind of trace this thesis that I think there is this genuine rebirth of belief in God, as more and more people come out of the woodwork who are sort of confirming that. So
awesome.
So yeah, if you're a podcast listener, just again look for the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and you can find it all, support, get the newsletter and everything else at justinbrierley.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you. You mentioned that you were one of the pioneers in podcasting. I'd like to think we were a little bit later, but we were also among those who were there before it became cool. We were I think we were 2015, which I don't even know when Joe Rogan was big yet, but I don't think it was 2015. Now, he apparently went for hundreds of episodes, in his words, before anyone cared. But I'd like to think we're among those, that
absolutely
got ahead of it.
If you've done over 500, you're definitely a long timer in this game.
For better or for worse. Here we are. That's great. So thank you, Justin. Appreciate it. Get the book, check out the podcast. I know it's been hugely instructive for me, like everything that you've produced. So I'm excited for what you're doing now, what God will do through you in the future. And I know our listeners will be as well. So thank you.
Oh. Well, thank you for having me on, Ben. God bless you.